All right. So, Avi, thanks very much for joining us for this lecture series from the Department of Psychiatry. And while people are coming in and registering, let me introduce you for the people who don't know you. Apologies for the background noise, but that's what it is. So Avi, as you probably all know, is a highly esteemed professor of psychiatry here. He was very well trained in both in Israel and in London. I'll just wait until the ambulances have passed by. Which takes a little while, as you can all hear.
Now they arrived at my building.
That's probably true. All right. Anyways, so he's Avi is a neuropsychologist and an epidemiologist. He's professor of preventative medicine and psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine here with us, of course, and also the director of the population research and the environmental epidemiology program at the Seaver Center. So he received his BA, MA, and PhD from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he has then worked in London at the King's College and the Institute of Psychiatry. He has done particularly important research, which he'll be presenting today, on at least something that I'm very interested in cognitive deficits and cognitive risk factors for schizophrenia. He's an expert, like you said, in epidemiology, using large databases, large longitudinal cohorts, from, for instance, the UK and other places that I think has made a huge impact in our understanding of the, let's say, prequelae of schizophrenia, and some of his research has been published in very prominent journals such as JAMA Psychiatry, the American Journal of Psychiatry, etc. Has been well funded, fortunately, for many, many years through the NIH and other agencies. So I'm very happy, Avi, that you're going to share some of your studies here, titled, as everyone can see, The Cognitive Dedifferentiation and Antecedents of the Psychosis Spectrum. But that's exactly what we've been talking about. I just talked, what actually precedes psychosis. And I think you've made a huge contribution to that field. So thank you much for joining us, Avi, and please take it away.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you very much for the very kind and supportive introduction. And thank you, everyone whom I do not see. I only see myself right now on this screen for joining today. Usually I put this slide at the end, but I thought this is what you're going to see is the results you're going to see, a brand new set of studies that this group has been conducting on psychosis. And I wanted to introduce those who carried the heavy load of what you're about to see. I'm mainly the one on stage presenting it. And the data itself comes from the UK, from a somewhat famous cohort, the ALSPA cohort that Stanley Zamet and Anthony David at Bristol University and King's College London and now at UCL have studied for many years, and I had the opportunity to work with them. And the specific ideas and recent work has been inspired by Stephen Levine, who's at Haifa University, and was really done by initially work by Joe Malone, who is now at Harvard Medical School, who was my PhD student, and now is carried by Anat Rothstein, who is at Haifa University. She was supposed to be here. She's a fellow, postdoc fellow, that COVID kept at home, and a few kids, including a very recent one. But I'm grateful to her and to Joe and to Stephen for everything I'm going to show you. One thing you can see is that the fact that the men at the bottom are very cheerful and happy, whereas the younger group at the top is a lot more serious. And I think that's because the ones there simply have tenure and the younger people still don't. many studies have shown that there are intellectual deficits in schizophrenia. This is a figure that kind of takes all sorts of different meta-analysis and puts the results together to give a illustration of how wide and widespread the cognitive deficit in schizophrenia is. Practically almost any cognitive test you will administer would show a cognitive deficit in schizophrenia. On average, it's a 15 IQ points, one standard deviation below the mean deficit. It varies slightly between functions. It's known now to be most pronounced in attention and processing speed, and slightly less in perception and language. But generally, anything you would measure, there will be a cognitive deficit. Epidemiologists and cognitive psychologists looking at the origins of the cognitive deficits in schizophrenia gave a lot of support to what's known as the neurodevelopmental model of the disease that was presented in the early to mid 1980s in the US and in the UK. Robin Murray and Daniel Weinberger were the founding fathers of this hypothesis, and its idea is that there is some underlying brain abnormality that manifests itself developmentally, in part with low IQ. And this is a now old but a wonderful meta-analysis that was done by a group at Harvard that was led by Larry Zeidman, which looked at cognitive functioning in children and adolescents who later on went to develop schizophrenia. And what they found is that those children as a group shown about half a standard deviation of an impairment, whereas the chronic schizophrenia patients show one standard deviation, bringing up a mechanistic idea that schizophrenia is associated with cognitive decline somewhere between childhood and adulthood. But at some point, once you have a meta-analysis, it pretty much means there's been too much done in that field anyway. Somebody wrote that developmental studies in psychiatry should shift from examining risk factors or asking whether low IQ predicts later illness, which is what all these early studies have shown, to testing models that can document age-related changes in brain function. And since one of those who argued this actually is giving you this talk, in the PhD thesis that Josephine Mullen was doing, we used data from the Alsbach cohort to look at the course of the cognitive impairment in schizophrenia. And we were very lucky, and we had assessments of IQ and an IQ subtest at 18 months, 4 years, 8 years, 15 years, and then at age 20, after some of the members of this cohort already had a psychotic disorder. And the beautiful work that Joe did, what she showed was that there is a progressive increase in the cognitive impairment in future schizophrenia patients. You can already see it manifesting at age 8 years, and it gets bigger and get larger and larger as they get older, until it reaches approximately one standard deviation of deficit somewhere in early adulthood. One thing to keep in mind from this work is that the deficits are seen not just in cases with psychotic disorder, but also those with psychotic experiences, and that by age 8, you can already see a visible cognitive impairment that distinguishes future patients from controls. But that being very exciting and very interesting, it still doesn't answer one fundamental question, which is what actually goes wrong? Because IQ is a term. We all think we know what it is. But what actually is not working in the brain, that's not something that those kind of analysis and those kind of questions answer. And to answer them, we started thinking that the right question is probably, how does IQ work? And to answer how does IQ work, you need to move from the testing models idea to actually talking about the structure of cognition. And because the structure of cognition can be central to theories and research on the causes of developmental disorders more generally and psychosis more specifically, this is a direction that we thought we would start looking at. And to go and understand what IQ is, you go to the father of IQ. And that is this distinguished guy that looks a little bit bitter, at least on the picture I have. Charles Spearman, about 120 years ago, made an observation that many diverse measures of cognitive performance were positively interrelated. What is now known as G, or he termed G, or general intellectual ability, or IQ. And remarkably, this is one of the most robust concepts in psychology or in medicine, if you want. Almost 100 years of work that repeatedly comes back and supports this kind of a conceptualization. And in fact, if you have a database with cognitive tests and you have a psychologist, you'll get factor analysis, which is a tool that is used to support these ideas of what is the structure of cognitive functioning. Overwhelmingly, almost all of these factor analytic studies show that cognitive tests tend to cluster into several broad ability factors, and you all know those terms: working memory, visual perception, attention, processing speed. All of these concepts grow out of the work and the ideas of Spearman. And like most psychologists or neuropsychologists working in the field of schizophrenia, when they had a data set with cognitive functioning, did a factor analysis. And what started coming up in the literature in the past few years, and it was much attention to it was given by Dwight Dickinson, who's now at the NIH, and Jim Gold, was that much of the variance, individual variability in IQ or neuropsychological tests in schizophrenia was due to a single common factor, one thing. Instead of these sub-tests or subgroups or working memory versus attention versus processing speed, they get one thing, almost like a G thing in psychosis. Now, this is a great journal, Biological Psychiatry, but this is a horrible study psychometrically. It's 18 measures on 87 healthy controls and 97 schizophrenia patients. That's way too small to go to any conclusion, but it's interesting. So here is another piece of work. Again, it's the same players with some more distinguished names, again doing a factor analysis on too small of a sample, but trying to use a slightly different format of factor analysis. Again, finding one factor. But what they also find is, if you look at the bottom correlation figure, is at the top, you see the healthy controls, and you see the correlations between those sub-factors that we all talk about: verbal, working memory, visual spatial. And at the bottom are the correlation between these factors in the schizophrenia group. And what you can easily see is that they are about 50% greater. So those factors are much more interlinked in the schizophrenia group than they are in the controls. A little bit later, finally, properly sized samples, the Katie trial and work by Phil Harvey with veterans data. And again, this time in the right sample size, they still come up with just a single factor. They don't find those sub-clusters of cognitive functioning that hundreds of years of cognitive research have shown. So something goes wrong, something about the structure of IQ, or how the way that IQ works is probably going wrong. And in fact, if you go back to Spearman, he actually had two pretty robust thoughts about how IQ works. And those are the differentiation and divergence hypothesis. The first one, the differentiation one, is arguing that over age mental abilities differentiate as children increase in chronological age, And the way that they used to do it, the simplest way of showing this is that when you look at the factor structure, the factors explain less and less variance as the kids gets older. So there is some differentiation. There is not one major thing that drives all your abilities. He also spoke about something called the divergence hypothesis that few years later, or in recent years, is referred to in psychiatry as cognitive reserves, accurately or inaccurately sometimes. And that is the idea that low ability in groups with low ability, with low IQ in a way, there would be stronger correlations between cognitive functions. And below is the slightly watered down terms that he used to describe the experiment that he did to test his hypothesis. But if you start thinking back about the findings from the schizophrenia factor analytic studies, maybe we're talking about some divergence that is taking place. But maybe we're also not asking the right questions, or asking the question of how IQ works in the wrong way, and we should actually ask ourselves, how does the brain work? And Spearman had nothing to do with brain imaging or with networks or with graph theory, but more recently we do. This is a review by Ed Bullmore that introduced the ideas of graph theory and networks to assess structural and functional systems, especially the brain. And the origins of this work is somewhere in the physical world, not in the brain imaging, and then in social networks. But when it was applied in a very, very smart way to schizophrenia, Bassett and her colleagues were showing that the brain network in schizophrenia is different than the one you see in controls, the activation patterns, that different networks appear, the hierarchy is different, the connections are a little bit different. And that is the interesting work published in 2008. It's on the right. Work by René's group in the Netherlands before he came, pretty much at the same time, also suggested that these hierarchical abnormalities or network changes might also relate to lack of efficiency in the way that the brain networks operate, so that the loss of functions also impairs on the way that the efficient brain no longer processes information. And when I was preparing this talk, I realized that we actually did have a hint towards that lack of efficiency and abnormal networking in the brain from work we did a couple of years back. And this is about trying to understand why there is a processing speed deficit. And what it turns out to show is that schizophrenia patients are relying on a completely different set of cognitive functions to solve a processing speed task than healthy people. So the network changes, and it's probably a very inefficient way to do it, because it's not effortless, but it's much more effortful to do the a processing speed task like this than it is to do it with healthy people. So there are hints that something that we see in neuroscience, in networks, that we see in brain functional connectivity, the efficiency and the degradation of networks, is possibly also it's also possible to capture that during using cognitive dimensions. And so if you take the ideas of networks, the ideas of the differentiation and differentiation from Spearman, and those longitudinal studies of declining IQ, what if the early cognitive deficits in psychosis is due to a cognitive network dedifferentiation? What if what underlies this cognitive decline is a dedifferentiation of a network? And through the working together with Stephen, Anat, and Joe, there is a method that addresses this in cognitive psychology, and it's psychometric network analysis. This slide kind of contrasts it with classic factor analysis just to give some flavor of what it's about. Um, and a lot of the work on IQ comes from factor analysis. All the work to date in schizophrenia on cognition comes from factor analysis. The main distinction is that psychometric network analysis gives us indications of the interactions between variables. It gives us the ability to identify the core functions that contribute to a certain network, and it does not require an underlying latent factors organized in a hierarchy. It allows you to actually let a network do its thing. And so we found it an intriguing tool to use. The sample comes from the Avon longitudinal study of children and parents, the ALSPEC cohort. These are all the children born in the Avon region. There we go. In the UK between April 1991 and December 1992. At age 8, almost 3,500 children were administered the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. They are being continuously followed up. The last follow-up was about 2 years ago, just before COVID. And we are looking at the age 18 and age 20 data, where there was a detailed clinical assessment of psychosis and depression. And we are going to look, using network analysis, on the structural cognitive functioning at age 8 in controls, in those with psychosis and those with depression. The sample size is very large. The number of variables is not very high. So these are rather reliable ways of doing it. For those of you who do not administer the any of the Wechsler scales on a regular basis, and even to those who do, sometimes we need a reminder of what you're doing. These are the sub-tests. You will see them appearing again through the results. They're capturing verbal knowledge, information, vocabulary, logical similarities between words in terms of the semantic meaning. They capture working memory through tests called digit span and arithmetic, where you're doing mental calculations or holding numbers in memory. And there is a visual spatial component to it, the puzzles and the cubes that are being assembled, and the arrangement of picture story. And I want you, through the results, just to keep in mind, looking at 3 tests, more specifically the 2 in blue, comprehension and picture arrangements, rely on social situations and social cues and social rules, in addition to the fact that they have a neuropsychological or a IQ-related characteristics. And the second one is coding, very simple coding. It's a speeded processing speed test. It's considered the one to be most impaired in schizophrenia. And it's worth looking at those tests while I go through all the results if there is only one thing you want to follow. And before we go further, we expect to see an early cognitive deficits in those 3 groups of that we are studying in controls. The IQ on average was about a little bit above 100. The future depressed individuals had an IQ which was the same as controls. There was no cognitive deficit at that age. It only developed later in more severe chronic patients with depression. And the group on the psychosis spectrum had a small, statistically significant, about quarter of a standard deviation, cognitive impairment already at age 8. So we have controls. We have a group with a future psychiatric set of symptoms and conditions that is not cognitively impaired, and a group that is only mildly impaired, but has a potentially different set of symptoms. And what is the psychometric network analysis made of? First of all, you will see circles, which are nodes, and those are the subscales or the items that we are bringing in from the Wechsler, the information, vocabulary. There are edges, the lines that connect the nodes, and if they are positive, they will be marked in green. If the correlation is positive, if the correlation is negative, they will be in red. And the thicker they are, the stronger is the relationship. And what we are interested in on top of that is the communities. So which subtests cluster together. and the strength centrality, or the centrality measure, which of all of these different cognitive measure is the most central to the network, the most important one. The king of the castle, as this figure shows. And to think about the differentiation versus de-differentiation, you can look here from, in my case, from left to right. The de-differentiated communities will simply come up as one community or few communities. And the more differentiated the network, the more communities we would see, between 1, 2, and 3 communities. And here are the results. So about 3,000 controls and 250 individual in the psychosis spectrum. And what you can see is that there are relationships between all the subtests that come in controls, and that there are 3 communities. In blue, you have a community which encompasses the verbal comprehension abilities. In red is the working memory processing speed, and in green is the visuospatial perception and reasoning cluster. These are almost classic clusters that you would see in many factor analytic studies using those tests in normal people. There are slight variations because these individuals are completely healthy, whereas other samples include a mixture of both cases and control, so which might move it. The 2 things to pay attention to are the fact that we almost do not see any negative correlation. There's only 1. And the fact that the digit symbol coding and the picture arrangement, the social one and the processing speed, are slightly out there from the main networks. Even though they're part of their communities, they have their own uniqueness. And in psychosis, we are only seeing 2 of these communities, things that, and they're colored in the way they should have been in the controls. So this entire cluster of verbal abilities have dissolved and gone primarily into the, it actually split half and half. It lost its uniqueness and went both into the visual spatial and to working memory processing speed. Processing speed has a strong negative association with some of the working memory components. And even more interestingly, whereas the centrality of vocabulary is what we see in controls, arithmetic, a measure of working memory, is what's central to the psychosis network. When we add depression, we see an even more intriguing finding. First of all, they are different from both the controls and the psychosis group. In a way, they are slightly over-differentiated. And while their centrality is still carried by vocabulary, you can see that the 2 tests, the comprehension and picture arrangements, 2 of the ones that are socially tapping into social skills, have a unique community in future depression patients. So we're seeing something of a de-differentiation in psychosis and over-differentiation in depression. If we go back to what Spearman was suggesting about people with low IQ having stronger communities, but we actually don't see that. They have a slightly different community structure than healthy controls, but there are still 3 components, and the central one is still the vocabulary, and they're clearly different than the psychosis group. So the fact that you have low IQ is different in terms of the structure of cognition than if you have in the future going to have psychosis, even though you have low IQ. And another way to look at it is to look at the matrix of correlations between the different tests. And I think it's pretty clear that there are differences. You see many more correlations between the different measures within the controls. They dissolve the statistically significant ones in the psychosis and the depression. There are much more negative correlation in psychosis and in depression than you see in controls. Now that set of results was reflective of what we see at age 8, looking to the future into the diagnosis that comes up. But what happens longitudinally to this structure of cognition? And to that, we are grateful for the fact that for about 7 years now, we have been following up on individuals in Ausbach that have psychotic symptoms and go on to develop a psychotic disorder. Those individuals were administered part of the same age 8 battery again at age 20. It was done with 98 controls, which were administered at age 8 and at age 20, 87 individuals on the psychosis spectrum, and also 30 individuals with depression. So because that sample is small, take it with a grain of salt, any results that we see about them. And network analysis and longitudinal modeling is a very new thing, and Anat is one of the few that have done studies like that. In this case, this is an example of what happened to the network of the mini-mental status examination over time in elderly samples. You can see the diminishing connections in the network as people age, and the increase in negative connectivity is just an illustration of how these things can be done. But we had the processing speed, the coding tests, the vocabulary, the working memory test, the use span, and block design administered twice, age 8, and then again at age 20. And these are the longitudinal networks that develop. And what you see in controls is what you would expect to see, that the same test at age 8 is the strongest predictor or the best linked or strongest link to the same test at age 20. Those structures of cognition maintain their strong relationship. If you were great at coding, if you had great processing speed at age 8, you will continue having great processing speed abilities at age 20. It's true for working memory, it's true for general knowledge, and for visual-spatial abilities. And then we see psychosis. And in psychosis, most of these relationships, if they stay, they mesh together into one community, one thing. There is no uniqueness in the longitudinal relationship that we see for cognition in healthy people that is carried over to psychosis. Moreover, whatever processing speed is capturing early in life is entirely independent of any component of cognition later. It's a completely different longitudinal network. If we look at depression, and again, take depression with a bit of a careful in terms of the interpretation, it lies somewhere in the middle. Some of the connections are there in exactly the same way as you expect to see them from healthy people, and some cognitive abilities have got disconnected, if you want to call it. So some conclusions. The neurodevelopmental deviations in cognitive functioning in psychosis seem to result from abnormalities in the structure of cognition. It's not just the mean score of IQ, there is some underlying network that is not right. Although individuals with psychosis and individuals with depression share low IQ later on in life, these results show that there is a distinction of how they get there. The developmental processes may not be the same, not early on nor later, although there are some similarities. And because of the long, although quite sporadic history of the dedifferentiation ideas in psychosis, because the genetic contribution to cognition may be different in low ability levels, and we have done some work on this, and because dedifferentiation ideas could be also important to some theories and some methods development in terms of cognitive remediation because of the ability to identify central playing components, it is hopefully important to attempt to confirm or refute this dedifferentiation hypothesis and early results that I've shown you. So this is all the science that I have to show you today. Went faster than I expected, but I'm happy to hear any of the questions you might have, thoughts, comments, ideas.
Thank you very much, Avi. It was a great talk and great insight how you've deconstructed the cognitive deficits in psychosis and schizophrenia. That is great. So yeah, we do have some time for questions. People can either use the chat box, raise a hand, and then I can actually make you talk. At least I cannot make you talk, but I can have others hear what you have to say. And you can have, there was a Q&A. So who wants to go? Avi, in the meantime, I have a question when people, gather their wits. So do you think this has implications for treatment, that we should focus on specific aspects of cognition that may be abnormal? And, if you have cognitive remediation and stuff, do you think it has implications for that?
So I think so. So if you take the results as they are and you interpret centrality as the core that sits at the heart of this cognitive network, you would like to treat the core. That would be, and based on that, the cognitive remediation should focus on working memory. It should not focus on processing speed. It should not focus, or drug development should focus on drugs for working memory. It might, if the results of the longitudinal network can be replicated, can be done in a larger network that looks at more subtests, and they are true, my gloomy self would say that there is very little hope that remediation or intervention after the onset would do anything. That it would, sorry, I'm being very criticized, critical. So I've just, it would be very hard to unmesh this one thing. You just, I don't see us kind of recreating cognition. Cognition needs differentiation. And it almost looks like we're losing this. So if, in a way, the prodromal concept should be pushed as far backwards as possible.
Yeah, but the problem that I have with the current concept of prodromal is that it very much focuses on psychosis, which in my book means you're already too late.
Yeah.
The cognitive deficits that you've shown precede even, limited psychotic symptoms. Yeah. So, I mean, how do you identify these kids? Because if you're focusing on psychosis or whatever you want to call it, blips, whatever, you're going to be too late, in my book. So how do you identify them?
In an ideal world, you could use cognitive testing at an early age to find high-risk groups. Oh, Sophia raised her hand, and perhaps identify a subgroup at risk, and try it. Yes, Sophia.
Yeah, you can talk, Sophia. You can even, yes, go ahead, Sophia.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you very much, Avi. This was brilliant. You're always very good at these things, but this was really inspiring. Since we're on the topic of prevention, there are two things really. One is that how the brain is put together probably starts before the age of 8. And it would be helpful to actually see how sensory and higher kind of cognitive functions get to mesh together from the early beginnings. That's one thing. And the second thing is that when we're talking about prevention, we're talking about people. So is there any way that we can personalize this structure you have identified? Because this is a group finding at the moment, so it cannot translate instantly to individuals, but there might be a way. And I'm sure if there is one, you would know it.
Yeah. Yes, and unfortunately, there is. We had some thoughts of how you might be able to find something like that, but personalized networks. But right now, I don't think there is anything. If Stephen or Anat are on this, and they might be, if they didn't miss, maybe they have some thoughts about it. But I'm thinking that I've been thinking that maybe a related concept, which is intra-individual variability, that could be tapped into this or could be related to this, might be the way to personalize it. It's this instability or inconsistency between cognitive functions or over consistency of cognitive functions on a single neuropsychological battery. But it might be that imaging would be a tool, by the way, Sophia.
Imaging can help. I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but imaging can help because what you're actually doing is you're using a version of graph theory analysis on cognitive data.
Yeah.
And imaging has been using graph theory on brain data for a long time. And there is a way towards kind of moving towards individualized sort of measures for the brain connectome,
right,
which could be translated without having imaging data, but just the method could be translated into personalized indices for the cognitome.
Yeah. Maybe we can run it on the.
We can definitely do that together.
Yeah. True.
All right.
The cognitome. We have a new term.
Avi, there are two questions in the Q&A, and then there's Ron Reeder who also raised his hand. I think the next one was Hero. He's in the Q&A, and then it's Ron Reeder. I'll take care of that, and then it's Matt Daub. So can you answer Hero's question?
Oh, let me see if I can see it.
You just press the Q&A.
Yeah, there we go. Oh, there we go. Interesting. Thank you. How younger control may look like.
You have to read the question out loud because otherwise.
Yes. So what Hero is asking is, are the schizophrenia or the future psychosis cases kind of lagging behind? Which means that if we looked at 5-year-olds or 4-year-olds or 3-year-olds, and we did the same analysis, would they show a lesser differentiation in the same way that the schizophrenia group shows it? And the answer to that is that we don't actually know. One of the problems of this is that the Wechsler scale, that version of it starts at age 7. And what Alspach, for example, has is a slightly different test, and it's hard to extrapolate from one set of tests, even if you think they're similar to just another one. But in previous work, when we talked about mental age, which is slightly different than IQ, it looks like the schizophrenia patients are lagging behind. So it is possible would be catching up. Although our longitudinal analysis that you saw here suggests that they just completely lose this differentiation, rather than catching up and having differentiation.
All right.
And Matthew.
Well, yeah, okay. Do Matt Klein. In fact, I think Ron Reeder raised his hand. He's first. So we'll do. So Ron, you can go ahead and talk. Ron?
Yes, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Okay, Avi, I'm wondering about IQ and what it reflects. And my sense is it's predominantly cortical functioning. Leaving out, in other words, cerebellar activity. Although certainly there's a coordination between the two, and coordination is a word that might be important here, is that thinking back to those studies Erlenmeyer Kimling did of the children of 2 schizophrenics, I think some of her most early and consistent findings were lack of fine motor coordination. And I think there's been a kind of resurgence of an interest, but I don't know if we have a whisk for cerebellar functioning other than these things I mentioned. Right. So this is a broader question. To what extent can we measure cerebellar activity in neuropsychological testing? And to what extent might it be an early attribute, or deficits in this be an early attribute of people predestined to become schizophrenic?
I'll try to answer your question in steps. So the first one, the motor difficulties in, for example, reaching motor milestones, standing, sitting, eye-hand coordination are quite well documented in very young babies and children that later on either go on to develop schizophrenia or are the offspring of individuals with schizophrenia, as you described in the early high-risk study. The thing is with that is that they, almost all of them, or everyone, catches up. They all stand, they all walk, they all have eye-hand coordination, even if it's not remarkable, the best. But these functions develop. You're right that neuropsychological testing, definitely not the tests that are included in the Wechsler intelligence scale, are not tailored to specifically tease apart cerebellar functions from cerebellum functions from lower or midbrain functions. They're more about cortical and some subcortical abilities. And I'm not sure to what extent we can even come up with good tests for it. But you are right, and maybe I should have also included that I will refer to the work, the 1990s work, Renee, correct me if I'm wrong, the Nancy Andreasen disconnectivity cerebellar frontal model of schizophrenia does have some, I think, resemblance to this, at least something related to this, even though it's focusing on the cerebellum. So there are these pieces, but motor, except for the fact that some of these tests do require eye-hand coordination, speeded motor functions, it's not a cerebellum kind of test.
Okay, by the way, I'm just realizing, Avi, maybe you want to stop sharing because we still, instead of seeing you prominently, we see that last slide.
Yep, I am trying to do that.
I mean,
I've put myself at the top to stop staring at myself on the side. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, then you can answer, Matt Dobbs' question in the Q&A.
Sure. So Matthew, thank you first of all for enjoying the presentation. Did you find any relationship between the patient's cognitive deficits and their degree of insight into? I didn't. It's not a line of work I've actually done. Anthony David, whom I worked with, have done a lot on this. So if you are interested in it, I'm sure you'll find many papers about it. But no, it's not something that I've looked into.
Okay. Anyone else? I think I've exhausted the questions then. Okay, Avi, thank you so much. It was really, as Sophia rightly said, very inspiring, and I think everyone enjoyed it very much. Very elegant research. So thank you for sharing. I think it's really
thank you everyone.
forward. Thanks again, and thanks all for joining. All the best.
Bye.
Bye.